At exactly 6:17 p.m. on June 14th, 2022, with 146 guests watching and 3 cameras recording, my sister-in-law shoved me so hard that my left heel snapped clean off, and I hit the marble floor in my own wedding reception hall. Then she stood over me, smoothed her silk dress, and said in a calm, almost bored voice, "Kneel and apologize, Evelyn. You embarrassed me." If you've ever been humiliated in front of a room full of people who were supposed to celebrate you, you already know this feeling, the way your chest tightens, the way your ears ring, the way time slows down, just enough for you to notice who looks away and who smiles. But here's the part no one in that ballroom knew yet. She didn't fall by accident, and she wasn't asking me to kneel because of pride. She was testing whether I would stay silent. Before I tell you what happened next, I need to ask you something. If someone humiliated you publicly on the happiest day of your life, would you fight back immediately, or would you stay quiet and wait? Because that choice, that exact moment, determined everything that came after. My name is Evelyn Harper. I was 29 years old that summer, a licensed event financial planner based in Charlotte, North Carolina. I specialized in budgeting large corporate functions, conventions, political fundraisers, nonprofit galas. I knew contracts, numbers, liabilities. I knew how to read risk in a room before anyone else saw it. What I didn't know was how quickly a family could turn into a liability. My husband, well, he was still my husband at 6:17 p.m. that night, was Daniel Carter. We had been together for 3 years. He was quiet, steady, a commercial real estate analyst, earning around $112,000 a year. We met during a regional developers conference where I handled budgeting for the event. He was calm in a way that made me feel safe. And that's exactly why I ignored the warning signs. The first warning was his sister, Lydia Carter. You know the type. 32 years old, never held a job longer than 8 months, but always dressed like she stepped out of a luxury catalog. She called herself a lifestyle consultant, which meant she posted affiliate links and lived mostly off their parents' money. From the day I met her, Lydia studied me, the way someone studies a competitor, not a future sister-in-law. At our engagement dinner, she asked me, smiling sweetly, "So, you're good with numbers. That's useful. Someone will need to manage the Carter family assets one day." I thought it was a joke. It wasn't. The Carter family wasn't just comfortable. They were wealthy in the quiet Southern way. Old money tied to commercial property investments. Their parents owned 11 retail buildings across 2 counties. Conservative estimate, $18 to $22 million in assets. But Daniel had always told me something very clearly. "The assets are in a family trust," he said once, "managed jointly between me and Lydia once our parents stepped down." At the time, I didn't think much about it. I should have, because Lydia had never hidden the fact that she didn't want to share control. In the months leading up to the wedding, her behavior escalated in small, sharp ways. She criticized the venue choice, even though I paid for 60% of the wedding costs myself. She complained about seating arrangements. She once accidentally spilled red wine on the ivory rehearsal dinner tablecloth while looking directly at me. Daniel always brushed it off. "She's just protective," he'd say. "You know how she is." Yes, I did know how she was, but I didn't yet know how far she would go. The day of the wedding itself was flawless until the reception. The venue was the Grand Meridian Ballroom, downtown capacity, 200 crystal chandeliers, black and white marble flooring, polished so smooth you could see reflections. Dinner had just ended. Guests were moving toward the dance floor. I was walking toward the bar to grab water. My dress weighed nearly 18 pounds, with the beating, and my feet were already aching. That's when Lydia stepped backward, directly into my path. The contact was barely a brush, my arm against her shoulder. But Lydia immediately threw her body forward, like she'd been struck. She collapsed dramatically onto the marble, clutching her wrist. The sound of her fall echoed across the ballroom. Music stopped. Conversations froze. And then came her voice, sharp, loud, carrying perfectly. She pushed me. Every head turned toward me. I remember thinking one strange, detached thought. This is not an accident. I stepped forward instinctively. Lydia, I barely touched you. Are you okay? She looked up at me, with eyes full of something that wasn't pain. It was calculation. Then she said it. Get down on your knees and apologize. Right now. There was a ripple of murmurs across the room. I heard someone whisper, "Is she serious?" I looked toward Daniel. He was standing about 10 feet away, frozen. Not moving, not speaking, not defending me. And in that moment, something inside my chest went very, very cold. Because the truth hit me all at once. He wasn't surprised. He was waiting to see what I would do. Lydia tilted her head slightly and lowered her voice just enough that only those nearby could hear. If you don't kneel, she said quietly, you're going to regret it more than you can imagine. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't about embarrassment. It wasn't about a fall. It wasn't even about control. It was about something much bigger. Something tied to money. Something tied to power. Something that had been decided long before my wedding day. So I did something that shocked everyone in that ballroom. I slowly bent my knees, and as the marble floor came closer, I locked eyes with Lydia and said one sentence that made her smile, because she thought she had already won. What she didn't know was that 2 days earlier, I had opened a document that wasn't meant for me to see. A document that explained exactly why she needed me silent, and exactly why she was willing to humiliate me in front of 146 witnesses to get it. 2 days before the wedding, at 8:42 p.m. on June 12th, I opened a manila envelope addressed to Daniel Carter that had been left on our kitchen counter, and inside was a document that listed my name next to a clause titled Liability Transfer Upon Marriage. I wasn't snooping. At least, that's what I told myself. The envelope had arrived with our other wedding paperwork, vendor confirmations, catering invoices, insurance certificates. As an event financial planner, I handled logistics by instinct. I sorted documents without thinking, but this one was different. It wasn't labeled with a vendor name. It wasn't addressed to both of us, and it had the letterhead of a law firm I recognized immediately. Kensington and Rourke Estate Attorneys, one of the most expensive trust management firms in North Carolina. I knew them because corporate clients used them to structure multi-million-dollar family trusts. The moment I saw their logo, my stomach tightened. And then I saw the title, Carter Family Asset Trust Amendment Proposal. If you've ever handled financial contracts, you know the feeling when something isn't right before you even read it. It's like seeing a storm cloud on a clear day. I should have waited for Daniel. I should have asked. Instead, I opened it. Inside were 12 pages of dense legal language. Most of it referred to routine trust, restructuring, asset valuation, updates, property reassessments, income distributions. But on page 7, there was a section highlighted in yellow. Clause 7.3, Spousal Liability Integration. My name appeared twice, not as beneficiary, not as spouse, as associated financial risk party. I read the paragraph 3 times before the meaning fully landed. It stated that once Daniel Carter married his spouse, would automatically become partially liable for any trust-related debts, legal claims, or asset disputes, unless she signed a separate waiver within 30 days. And below that was another line, joint trust authority, voting power, to remain exclusively between Daniel Carter and Lydia Carter, which meant something very specific. I would have financial liability, but zero decision-making rights. I felt the blood drain from my face as I kept reading, because there was one more clause. If Daniel became incapacitated, died, or relinquished control, Lydia would assume full authority over the trust, including legal claims against associated parties. Associated parties. That meant me. In plain English, it meant this. If anything happened, Lydia could legally come after me for money tied to assets I never controlled. At that moment, standing alone in our kitchen, I felt something inside me shift. Not panic, not anger, calculation. Because this wasn't a mistake. Legal firms like Kensington and Rourke don't insert liability clauses without explicit client approval. Daniel knew, and he had never told me. I folded the document back carefully, placed it exactly as I found it. And for the next 2 days, I said nothing, because I needed to understand one thing first. Was Daniel hiding this because he was careless, or because he was complicit? If you were in my position, what would you have done? Confront him immediately, or stay quiet and watch? I chose silence, and silence is very powerful when people think you don't know the rules of their game. On the morning of the wedding, Daniel was unusually distracted. He checked his phone constantly, stepped outside twice to take calls. Once, when he came back inside, I noticed something small but telling. He didn't look at me. He looked at Lydia. She gave him a tiny nod. Not a smile, not reassurance. Approval. That was when I understood. They weren't just siblings. They were partners in something. But I still didn't know how far it went. Until the reception, until the fall, until the moment Lydia told me to kneel. And now, back on that marble floor at 6:18 p.m., with 146 people watching my knees touching the cold stone, my wedding dress pooling around me like spilled milk. I looked up at her, and I said very quietly, so only she could hear, "You should have told me." The liability clause came with a performance requirement. For one fraction of a second, Lydia's expression cracked. Not fear, recognition. She knew exactly what I meant. Then her smile returned sharper this time, and she leaned closer, whispering back, "You opened something that didn't belong to you." It wasn't a question. It was confirmation. She knew I had seen the document, which meant something else. They had been expecting me to either discover it or be forced into signing it after the wedding. Either way, humiliation was part of the strategy. Public dominance creates private compliance. That's something I learned years ago negotiating corporate contracts. People who break you emotionally first expect you to surrender financially later. Lydia straightened and raised her voice again for the room. "She admits it," she announced dramatically. "She knows she's at fault. Fault, not for bumping into her, for something much bigger." And that's when I noticed something that made my heart slow down instead of race. At the far edge of the ballroom, near the videography station, one of the camera operators was adjusting his lens, zoomed directly on us, recording everything. And unlike most guests, he wasn't confused. He looked focused, intent, like he had been waiting for this moment, which was strange because I hadn't hired any independent videographers. The wedding package included only one contracted crew. This was a second camera, and I suddenly realized something chilling. Someone had arranged for multiple angles of what was happening, not for memories, for documentation. I lifted my gaze back to Lydia, and for the first time since she fell, I noticed something small but critical. Her wrist, the one she claimed was injured, wasn't trembling. It wasn't swelling. It wasn't even red. But her fingers were curled around something thin and metallic, hidden under her sleeve. Something that looked very much like a ring-shaped key. And in that instant, a new question slammed into my mind. Not why she wanted me to kneel, but what she needed access to. That required a key. Because suddenly, the trust document didn't feel like the real trap. It felt like the first layer of something much deeper. Something that had already been set in motion long before I walked down the aisle. And the worst part, I was beginning to realize the wedding itself might never have been the goal. At exactly 6:21 p.m., 3 minutes after I knelt on the marble floor in my wedding dress, Lydia Carter stepped back, adjusted her bracelet, and quietly said one sentence that no one else heard over the murmuring crowd. "Good," she whispered. "Now we can move to the next step." Not thank you, not apology accepted. The next step. If you've ever been manipulated by someone who plans 3 moves ahead, you recognize that tone immediately. The calm certainty of someone who believes the outcome is already locked in. But here's what Lydia didn't know. When you spend years negotiating multi-million-dollar corporate event contracts, you learn something very important. People who believe they're winning tend to reveal their strategy. And all you have to do is stay still long enough to watch. So I remained on my knees, not out of submission, out of observation. Guests around us were whispering, shifting, uncomfortably. Someone tried to laugh nervously. A distant aunt muttered, "This is getting out of hand." But Daniel still hadn't moved. He stood exactly where he had been when Lydia fell. 10 feet away, hands at his sides, face pale, silent. That silence said more than any words he could have spoken. Because he wasn't shocked. He was waiting for Lydia to finish something. I slowly raised my head and looked at him, and that's when he finally spoke. "Evie," he said, voice low but strained, "just apologize properly so we can end this." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "Lydia, stop. Just end this." In that moment, a strange clarity settled over me. This wasn't about sibling loyalty. This wasn't even about control. This was about compliance. And suddenly, the document I'd read 2 nights earlier snapped into sharper focus. Spousal liability integration. Associated financial risk party. Those words weren't passive. They were leverage, which meant something very simple. They needed me legally bound before something else happened. And whatever that something else was, it hadn't happened yet. That realization steadied me completely, because it meant I still had time. I lowered my gaze and said clearly enough for nearby guests to hear. "I'm sorry." Lydia felt embarrassed. A few people gasped softly. It was technically an apology, but not an admission of guilt. Lydia's smile tightened. She knew exactly what I had done. And for the first time, irritation flickered across her face. But she quickly masked it and turned toward Daniel. "It's fine," she said sweetly. "We can continue the reception now." She extended her hand. Not to me, to Daniel. And that was when I noticed something small but crucial. In her palm was that thin, metallic object, again the ring-shaped key. She pressed it into his hand quickly, almost invisibly. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but I did, because Lydia never did anything without purpose. And keys, especially physical ones, almost always meant one of 2 things: access to a safety deposit box or access to a secure storage unit, neither of which had anything to do with a wedding reception. My heart didn't race. It slowed, because now the pattern was becoming clearer. They needed me legally tied to the trust first. Then they needed access to something locked. And then only then would whatever plan they had move forward, which meant this humiliation wasn't the end. It was step 1. If you're still with me, let me ask you something. Have you ever realized in the middle of a crisis that you weren't actually reacting to an accident? You were standing inside a carefully staged scene, because that's exactly what it felt like. A performance. And I had just played the role they expected. But Lydia made one mistake. She assumed kneeling meant surrender. What it actually gave me was time. Time to watch, time to listen, time to gather something much more valuable than dignity: evidence. The reception resumed awkwardly after that. Music restarted. Guests tried to act normal, but the energy had shifted permanently. Everywhere I walked, conversations stopped. Eyes followed me, not with sympathy, with curiosity. Humiliation spreads faster than truth. Daniel disappeared for nearly 20 minutes after the incident. When he returned, his jacket pocket bulged slightly, just enough to suggest something small but solid inside. Like a metal key, he avoided eye contact with me for the rest of the evening. And that told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't just involved, he was nervous. And nervous people make mistakes. Around 8:05 p.m., during the final hour of the reception. I stepped outside, onto the terrace for air. The night was warm, humid, the city lights reflecting off the glass towers downtown. I thought I was alone, until I heard voices near the service entrance. Lydia's voice first. Sharp, controlled. "You saw how easily she folded," she said. "Once the marriage certificate is filed tomorrow, she's legally attached. After that, it won't matter what she wants." A male voice answered. Not Daniel's. Older, calm. "Good," the man said, "because the bank won't release the restructuring funds without a secondary liability holder." Restructuring funds. My stomach tightened. The man continued. "The outstanding loans on the Carter retail properties total $6.3 million. We need someone else legally tied before the audit finishes." Audit. Loans. Liability holder. In that instant, everything clicked into place. The Carter family wasn't just managing assets. They were drowning in hidden debt, and they needed someone legally bound to absorb the fallout. Me. I stepped back silently before they could notice me. But one thought echoed in my mind louder than anything else. They weren't just planning to humiliate me. They were planning to use me. And suddenly, the trust document didn't feel like a trap anymore. It felt like a warning. Because if they needed me this badly, it meant something inside their empire was already collapsing. And the key Lydia handed Daniel earlier that night. It probably unlocked the proof of exactly how deep that collapse went. At 9:12 a.m., the morning after my wedding, while the marriage license was being processed at the Mecklenburg County Register of Deeds, Daniel Carter received a phone call that made his hands shake so badly he dropped his coffee mug onto the kitchen tile. The screen lit up with one word. Audit. Not a contact name, not a company, just that. He didn't notice I saw it. He just snatched the phone and stepped onto the balcony, closing the sliding door halfway, not enough to block the sound completely. And for the first time since the wedding, I heard panic in his voice. "Yes," he said urgently. "No, we're still within the window. The license is being filed today. She's already legally tied once it's recorded." My chest tightened, but my mind stayed calm. Because that sentence confirmed something critical. They weren't waiting for me to sign anything. Marriage alone was enough to attach me to the liability structure. And that meant one thing. The clock wasn't counting down for me. It was counting down for them. He kept speaking in low, rapid bursts. "No, she doesn't know the numbers. Lydia handled that. We just need until the refinance clears." Refinance. Another financial red flag. Because refinancing usually means two possibilities. You're restructuring to expand, or you're restructuring because you can't pay what you already owe. And given everything I had overheard the night before, I knew exactly which one this was. Daniel ended the call and stood still on the balcony for nearly a full minute before coming back inside. His face looked drained. He tried to smile when he saw me. "Morning?" he said lightly, like nothing had happened. "Big day. We should celebrate." Celebrate. The word felt hollow, but I nodded anyway, because I wasn't ready to reveal what I knew. Not yet. Silence was still my strongest advantage. He walked to the kitchen counter, grabbed an envelope, and slid it toward me. "Just some routine paperwork," he said casually. "Standard trust documentation. My parents' attorney wants everything updated now that we're married." Routine. There's something almost insulting about how manipulators rely on routine language to hide dangerous things. I looked at the envelope. Kensington and Rourke, letterhead again. Exactly like the one I had opened 2 nights earlier. Except this one had a sticky note attached. Signed by June 30th to avoid administrative delays. Avoid delays. Not avoid liability. Not protect your rights. Just avoid delays. I didn't open it. Instead, I asked a simple question. "What happens if I don't sign?" Daniel hesitated, only for a second. But it was enough. "It just complicates some financial restructuring," he said quickly. "Nothing major. It's mostly for paperwork efficiency." Paperwork efficiency. I almost laughed. Because no one asks you to assume legal financial liability for efficiency. They do it for survival. And right now, the Carter family clearly needed something to survive. I pushed the envelope back toward him. "I'll review it later," I said calmly. His jaw tightened slightly, a small crack in his composure, because that wasn't the answer he expected. He expected immediate compliance, just like Lydia had expected me to kneel without resistance. But hesitation creates leverage, and leverage creates fear. The rest of the morning passed in strained normalcy. We had brunch plans with his parents and Lydia at 11:30 a.m. at their house, which suddenly felt less like a family gathering and more like a negotiation table. If you've ever walked into a room knowing the people inside are hiding something from you, you know the strange way your senses sharpen. Every gesture becomes a clue. Every silence becomes louder than words. The Carter house was immaculate as always, colonial style, white columns, carefully trimmed hedges. But something felt different that day. The tension was visible. His father, Thomas Carter, usually warm and talkative, barely spoke. His mother kept refilling her water glass without drinking, and Lydia watched me the entire time with that same calculating expression, like she was measuring how close she was to securing something valuable. Halfway through brunch, Lydia finally broke the silence, so she said smoothly, "Have you had time to sign the trust integration forms yet?" Not even pretending it was casual. Straight to the point. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside me. His parents avoided eye contact entirely. And that confirmed something else. This wasn't just Lydia's plan. The entire family knew. I set my fork down calmly. "I'm reviewing them carefully," I said. "There are a lot of financial obligations listed." Lydia's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, don't worry about that," she said lightly. "It's mostly technical language. Just standard protection for the family." Protection. Yes, for the family. Not for me. I leaned back slightly and asked protection from what exactly? The room went silent. Even the sound of cutlery stopped. Lydia's gaze hardened. But before she could answer, Thomas Carter spoke abruptly. "It's just routine trust restructuring," he said stiffly. "Nothing you need to concern yourself with. Nothing you need to concern yourself with." That sentence told me everything. Because people only say that when there is absolutely something you should be concerned about. And then Lydia made a mistake. A small one, but enough. She tapped her fingers lightly on the table, and as her sleeve shifted, I saw it again. That thin metal ring-shaped key. Not hidden this time, fully visible, hanging from a small gold chain bracelet. And engraved on the surface was a tiny number. My pulse slowed again, because I recognized that numbering format instantly. It wasn't a house key. It wasn't a locker key. It was a bank safety deposit box key, which meant one thing. There was something locked away, something important enough that Lydia kept the key physically on her at all times. Something that probably contained documents, or proof, or debt records. And suddenly, a new question settled heavily in my mind. If the Carter family trust was drowning in hidden loans, what exactly was inside deposit box number 317 that they were so desperate to keep hidden? And more importantly, why did they need me legally bound before anyone else could see it? At 2:03 p.m. on June 16th, exactly 44 hours after my wedding reception, I walked into the First Federal Bank branch on Trade Street and saw Lydia Carter standing at the private vault desk, arguing in a low, furious voice with a bank manager. And hanging from her bracelet, glinting under the fluorescent lights, was the small metal key engraved with the number 317. For a moment, I considered turning around, not out of fear, out of timing, because timing is everything when you're dealing with people who think they control the entire board. But then, Lydia said something that froze me in place. "You told us we had, until the audit finalized," she snapped. "We need access today." Need, not want. Need. And that single word told me everything. Whatever was inside safety deposit box 317 wasn't just important. It was urgent. And when something is urgent in a financial crisis, it's usually because it can either save you or destroy you. I stayed behind the partition near the customer service area, pretending to review paperwork while listening. The bank manager, a middle-aged woman with a calm, practiced tone, replied carefully. Miss Carter, access requires both registered key holders present. That policy hasn't changed. Both registered key holders. My mind moved quickly, which meant Lydia alone couldn't open it. She needed someone else, Daniel or their father. But then Lydia said something that made my stomach tighten. He'll be here, she said impatiently. But we can't wait much longer. The refinancing deadline is in 12 days. 12 days. That wasn't a vague timeline. That was a financial countdown. The manager lowered her voice slightly, but I still caught the words. If the restructuring fails, the bank will proceed with lien enforcement on the Carter retail portfolio. Lien enforcement, that meant foreclosure. Multiple properties, millions at stake. In that instant, the full scale of the situation became crystal clear. The Carter family wasn't just dealing with hidden debt. They were on the edge of losing everything. All 11 commercial buildings, decades of family wealth, gone. And they needed something inside deposit box 317 to stop that from happening. But there was another layer, because they also needed me legally tied before accessing it, which meant whatever was inside that box would legally affect me once they opened it. That realization sent a chill down my spine, because it suggested something very specific. Not just financial records, not just contracts, something that could legally transfer responsibility, or prove liability, or even trigger legal claims. Lydia stepped back from the desk, pacing tightly, and that was when she noticed me. Our eyes locked across the lobby. For half a second, shock flickered across her face. Then it disappeared behind that familiar cold smile. She walked toward me, slowly, heels clicking against the polished floor. "Well," she said smoothly, stopping a few feet away. "What a coincidence." Coincidence? No, nothing about this was coincidence. "I came to open a joint savings account," I replied, calmly holding up a blank form from the front desk, which wasn't entirely a lie, because the form was real, but the reason I was there wasn't. Lydia studied me carefully, like she was trying to calculate whether I had heard anything. "What are the odds," she said lightly, "that we'd run into each other here?" Her tone was casual, but her eyes were sharp, searching, probing, testing. I held her gaze and asked quietly, "Is everything okay with the family trust?" The effect was immediate. Her smile froze, just slightly, but enough, because that question wasn't something I was supposed to ask, and we both knew it. For a split second, something darker flickered in her expression. Fear, not for herself, for control. But Lydia recovered quickly. "Of course," she said smoothly. "Why wouldn't it be?" I tilted my head slightly, because I overheard the word alien enforcement. The silence between us tightened instantly. The air felt heavier, and for the first time since I met her, Lydia didn't have a quick response, because I had just confirmed something she desperately didn't want confirmed. I knew, at least part of it, and that changed the power balance in a way she couldn't immediately fix. Her voice dropped lower. "You shouldn't be listening to conversations that don't involve you." There it was again, the same phrase, the same underlying message. Stay in your place. Stay silent. Stay compliant. But this time, I didn't stay silent. I leaned closer slightly and said very softly, "You shouldn't try to attach someone to millions in debt without telling them the truth first." Her pupils contracted, just for a second, but that second was enough, because it told me one crucial thing. She hadn't expected me to understand the scale. She thought I only knew about the liability clause. Not the numbers, not the foreclosure risk, not the 12-day deadline, and that miscalculation shifted everything. Lydia straightened her voice, sharpening. "You have no idea what you're talking about." I met her gaze calmly. "Then explain it." She didn't, because she couldn't, not without revealing too much. And that's when Daniel walked into the bank lobby, his face pale, his movements rushed. He saw us standing together and immediately froze, like a man who just realized the situation had spiraled beyond his control. In his hand, he held something small, metallic, another key, matching Lydia's, which meant one thing. The moment he reached the vault desk, deposit box 317 was about to be opened, and whatever was inside that box was finally going to come into the light. The only question was this: would it destroy them or pull me down with them? At 2:17 p.m., inside the first Federal Bank vault corridor, with fluorescent lights humming overhead and a security camera positioned directly above the door, Daniel Carter slid the second key into safety deposit box number 317, and his hand trembled so violently that he missed the slot twice before finally getting it in. That was the moment I knew for certain. Whatever was inside that box wasn't just paperwork. It was something he was afraid to face. And fear like that doesn't come from numbers alone. It comes from consequences. The bank vault area was colder than the lobby, both in temperature and atmosphere. The air carried that sterile scent of metal and paper, the smell of secrets stored too long. I shouldn't have been there. By policy, only registered key holders were allowed inside. But Lydia had made a choice the moment she saw me in the lobby. She didn't stop me. She didn't ask me to leave. Instead, she turned to the vault manager and said something that surprised even Daniel. "She's his spouse," Lydia said smoothly, "and soon she'll be legally associated with the trust restructuring. It's fine." Fine. That word echoed strangely, because nothing about this situation was fine. But Lydia let me in for a reason, and I realized it the second we stepped inside the vault corridor. She wanted me to see something. Not everything, but something specific. People who manipulate through financial leverage often rely on a psychological tactic. Shock first, explanation later. Because when someone is overwhelmed, they sign things they would normally question. And Lydia believed she was about to overwhelm me. Daniel finally managed to turn the key. Lydia inserted hers simultaneously. The lock clicked open with a heavy metallic sound. Daniel pulled the narrow metal drawer out slowly. Inside were 3 thick folders, 1 sealed envelope, and a small black USB drive. Lydia reached in immediately and grabbed the top folder, flipping it open with practiced familiarity. Daniel didn't touch anything. He just stared, which told me he had never actually looked inside before. He had been trusting Lydia, and now he was seeing the truth for the first time. Lydia turned the folder toward me, her voice calm, controlled. "This," she said, "is why you need to sign the integration forms." The top page was labeled Carter Retail Holdings Consolidated Loan Summary. Below it was a list of properties. 11 addresses, all familiar, all part of the Carter family empire. And next to each one was a number. Outstanding debt balances. The total sat at the bottom in bold. $6,482,000. My pulse didn't spike because I had already suspected the scale. But then I noticed something far more disturbing. Every loan had the same annotation beside it. Personal guarantee required secondary. Secondary, not primary, which meant someone else had already guaranteed those loans first. Probably Daniel's parents, and the bank was demanding another person legally tied in case they defaulted, which was exactly where I came in. Lydia watched my face closely, waiting for panic, waiting for emotional collapse, waiting for surrender. But I just looked at the next page, and that was when everything shifted. Because the second page wasn't about debt. It was about something much worse. Fraud exposure risk. There were highlighted sections referencing irregular accounting transfers between trust accounts and personal accounts over the past 3 years. And beside those entries were initials. LC, Lydia Carter. My chest tightened slightly. Not because I was shocked, because the pattern was suddenly clear. This wasn't just a family struggling with loans. This was a family covering up financial mismanagement, possibly even embezzlement, and they needed someone legally tied to absorb liability if regulators investigated, which meant they weren't just trying to use me as a financial buffer. They were trying to use me as a legal shield. I looked up slowly. Lydia's eyes were sharp, assessing. "Well," she asked coolly, "now you understand why cooperation matters." Cooperation, another word that really meant control. I spoke quietly. "You want me tied to this before an audit finds those transfers." Daniel's head snapped toward Lydia. "What transfers?" he asked hoarsely. And in that instant, I realized something else. Daniel hadn't known, not the full truth. He knew about debt, but not about irregular transactions, not about Lydia moving money. Lydia's composure cracked for the first time. "Don't be dramatic," she snapped. "They're just temporary reallocations." Temporary reallocations, a phrase often used when someone doesn't want to say the word misappropriation. Daniel's voice shook. "Lydia, what did you do?" She didn't answer him. She looked at me instead, because in that moment, I was no longer just a liability holder. I was a witness, and witnesses change everything. She stepped closer to me and lowered her voice. "You can still choose to be part of the solution," she said quietly. "Or you can destroy this family." Destroy. The word lingered in the cold vault air, as if she believed the responsibility for everything rested on me. Not on the choices she had made, not on the money she had moved, not on the lies she had constructed. But then I noticed something else inside the deposit box. The sealed envelope. It was thicker than the folders, stamped with a law firm seal, not Kensington and Rourke. A different one. Federal, which meant only one thing. Legal investigation documentation. And suddenly, a new realization hit me. This situation wasn't just about avoiding foreclosure. It was about avoiding criminal scrutiny, which meant the Carter family wasn't just collapsing financially. They were standing on the edge of something much more dangerous. And Lydia hadn't shown me that envelope yet. Because whatever was inside it was the real reason they needed me legally bound before the audit finished. At 2:24 p.m., standing inside the bank vault corridor, with the metal drawer still open in front of us, I reached past Lydia Carter's hand and touched the sealed federal envelope, and she grabbed my wrist so fast that her nails dug into my skin hard enough to leave crescent marks. "Don't," she said sharply. Not calm, not calculated, sharp, raw, afraid. And in that instant, the entire power dynamic shifted. Because until that moment, Lydia had controlled every move with icy precision. But fear, real fear, is impossible to fake, and her reaction told me something more clearly than any document inside that box could have. That envelope was the true danger, not the loans, not the trust clauses, not even the irregular transfers. That envelope contained something that could destroy her completely. I didn't pull my hand away. Instead, I held her gaze steadily and said quietly, "If it doesn't concern me, you wouldn't care whether I see it." Daniel's breathing had become shallow beside us. He looked back and forth between us, like a man watching the foundation of his life crack open in real time. "Lydia," he said hoarsely, "what's in that envelope?" She didn't answer, which was answer enough. Silence filled the narrow vault corridor, heavy, pressurized. And in that silence, I felt something inside me settle into an unfamiliar stillness. Not anger, not even hurt, just clarity. Because this was the moment I stopped thinking of myself as part of the Carter family and started seeing them as a risk profile, a collapsing financial structure, a liability cluster, something I had spent my entire professional career learning how to evaluate. And once you see people as risk instead of family, your emotional leverage over them disappears. Lydia slowly released my wrist, but her voice came out low and deadly controlled. "That envelope," she said, "is privileged legal correspondence. It doesn't involve you." I tilted my head slightly. "Everything in this box is being used to involve me." Her jaw tightened, because she couldn't argue that. Not anymore. Daniel stepped forward, suddenly, his voice trembling. "Lydia, I deserve to know," he said. "You said the restructuring was under control. You said the audit was routine." Lydia turned toward him, and for the first time, I saw genuine contempt in her eyes. "It was under control," she said coldly, "until you insisted on marrying someone who doesn't understand how family loyalty works." Loyalty, that word again, always used by people who mean obedience. Daniel flinched. "But you said the debt was manageable," he whispered. "It is," Lydia snapped, "if we follow the plan." The plan. And that's when everything inside me clicked into its final position. The humiliation at the wedding, the liability clause, the pressure to sign quickly. The key, the urgency. It wasn't random. It wasn't just greed. It was strategy, a step-by-step sequence designed to trap me legally before an external event occurred. And that external event was clearly tied to whatever was inside that sealed envelope, which meant one simple thing. Time wasn't running out for me. It was running out for Lydia, and that realization changed everything. Because when someone is desperate against a deadline, they become predictable, and predictable opponents are easy to defeat. I stepped back from the deposit box slowly. "I don't need to see it today," I said calmly. Both Lydia and Daniel looked at me in shock, because that wasn't the reaction either of them expected. They expected me to demand answers, to argue, to panic. But calmness is deeply unsettling when someone expects fear. I continued quietly. "I already know enough." Lydia narrowed her eyes. "What exactly do you think you know?" I met her gaze without blinking. "I know you moved trust funds into personal accounts." Her pupils contracted. "I know the bank audit is tied to those transfers." Daniel sucked in a sharp breath. "And I know," I finished softly, "that whatever is in that envelope explains why you need me legally tied before it's opened." Silence slammed into the corridor like a physical force. Daniel's face went completely white, because in that moment, he understood something devastating. He wasn't Lydia's partner. He was her tool. She had been controlling information from him just as carefully as she had from me. And for the first time since this began, I saw doubt appear in his eyes. Not about me, about her. Lydia saw it too, and something dark flickered across her face, because doubt is the most dangerous crack in any alliance. She turned away abruptly and began gathering the folders back into the box. "This conversation is over," she said tightly. "Daniel Lockett." Her voice had changed. Less controlled, more urgent, which meant something inside that envelope had a timeline attached to it. And suddenly, a new question formed in my mind. Not what was inside it, but when it would be opened. Because sealed federal correspondence doesn't stay sealed forever. It's usually opened on a specific date, at a specific event, with legal witnesses present. And that meant whatever truth Lydia was hiding was scheduled to come into the light soon, very soon. As Daniel slid the metal drawer back into the vault slot, I noticed something else that made my pulse slow to a near calm. On the front of the sealed envelope, partially visible under Lydia's hand, was a small printed line. Scheduled disclosure date, July 1st, exactly 15 days away. And in that moment, everything became perfectly clear. Lydia wasn't trying to humiliate me for control. She was trying to secure a legal shield before a bomb went off. A bomb she couldn't stop. Only survive. The only problem was, she didn't realize yet that I had no intention of being anywhere near the blast when it did. At 7:02 a.m. on June 18th, 13 days before the scheduled disclosure date, printed on that sealed envelope, I sat alone in my office and opened a new spreadsheet titled Exit Strategy, with 5 columns labeled Legal Exposure, Financial Separation, Evidence Chain, Timeline Control, and Public Witnesses. Because once you realize you're standing inside someone else's financial collapse, there's only one intelligent move left. You don't argue. You don't panic. You prepare to step out cleanly, legally, and permanently before the structure falls. That morning, was the first time since the wedding that I allowed myself to feel something fully. Not grief, not anger, relief, because clarity is liberating. And for the first time, I wasn't reacting to Lydia Carter's moves. I was designing my own. If you've ever quietly prepared your exit while the other person still thinks they're in control, you know the strange calm that comes with it. It's not revenge, it's precision. The first column I worked on was legal exposure. Based on what I'd seen in Deposit Box 317, the risks were obvious. The trust loans, totaling over $6.4 million. The irregular transfers tied to Lydia, the pending audit, and the unknown contents of the federal envelope scheduled for July 1st. But here's the key detail Lydia had overlooked. Marriage alone does not automatically transfer liability for pre-existing debts in North Carolina unless specific legal conditions are met. And those conditions depended heavily on signed integration agreements, which I had not signed and would never sign. That meant something very simple. Time was my greatest protection. As long as I delayed everything until after July 1st, whatever exploded inside that envelope would hit Lydia, not me. The second column was financial separation. By June 19th, I quietly moved my personal savings, $142,000, accumulated over years of work, into a new account at a different bank, under my maiden name documentation. Perfectly legal, perfectly routine, completely invisible to Daniel's financial oversight. I also removed my name from our joint credit card authorization and froze the account pending billing verification. Not dramatic, not confrontational, just procedural, the kind of quiet moves financial professionals make every day. The third column, evidence chain, was the most critical, because information without documentation is just suspicion, and suspicion doesn't protect you in court. Over the next 4 days, I gathered everything methodically. Screenshots of the trust amendment documents, photos of the loan summary pages, time-stamped notes of conversations I had overheard, even a copy of the wedding reception video footage showing Lydia staging her fall. Yes, I had obtained it. Because on June 17th, I contacted the videography company directly and requested all raw footage under my contractual rights as the primary client. What they sent me included something Lydia clearly hadn't anticipated. A wide-angle camera angle from the ballroom corner. And in that footage, it was unmistakably clear. Lydia stepped backward deliberately. She looked directly at me, and then she dropped herself forward before our arms even touched. It was performance. Calculated, documented, and suddenly, that humiliation she had engineered became evidence of coercion. The fourth column, timeline control, required the most patience. Because the biggest mistake people make when they discover betrayal is acting too soon. I didn't confront Daniel. I didn't argue with Lydia. I didn't even mention the trust documents again. Instead, I behaved exactly as they expected. Quiet, compliant, emotionally withdrawn, which made them relax. And when people relax, they stop guarding their weaknesses. During that week, I noticed Daniel growing increasingly anxious. He checked financial emails constantly, took late-night calls. Once at 1:14 a.m., I overheard him whispering in the living room. What happens if she refuses to sign? He asked someone on the phone. A pause. Then his voice cracked slightly. Because the bank said they won't finalize the refinance without secondary liability attached. That confirmed what I already knew. He wasn't just complicit. He was trapped. Lydia had told him marriage would solve everything, but now he was realizing it might not. And doubt inside him was growing, which would become very important later. The final column, public witnesses, was where my strategy became something more than self-protection. Because I wasn't just planning to escape quietly. I was planning to ensure Lydia could never target me again. And that required one critical element: visibility. People like Lydia thrive in private control environments. They manipulate behind closed doors. They rely on family loyalty and secrecy, but they cannot operate effectively when truth becomes public. And then I remembered something crucial: the scheduled disclosure date printed on that federal envelope, July 1st, the same date as the Carter family's annual Investors Appreciation Gala, an event attended by property partners, bank representatives, financial auditors, legal advisors, over 200 stakeholders. In other words, the worst possible place for a hidden truth to surface, and the perfect place for it to be witnessed. That realization settled into my mind like a final puzzle piece clicking into place. Because suddenly, Lydia's entire strategy made sense. She didn't just need me legally bound before July 1st. She needed me bound before that gala, before those witnesses, before whatever was inside that envelope became public. And in that moment, sitting in my quiet office, looking at the completed spreadsheet, I understood something with absolute certainty. The Carter empire wasn't just about to face financial exposure. It was about to face public collapse. And Lydia had been trying to drag me down with her to soften the impact. The only problem was she still believed I was too broken, too humiliated, too emotionally stunned to fight back. She didn't know I had spent the past 6 days preparing something far more dangerous than confrontation: documentation, timing, and a plan to ensure that when July 1st arrived, I wouldn't be standing beside her. I would be standing across from her, with proof in my hands. At 11:36 p.m. on June 27th, 4 days before the Carter Investors Appreciation Gala, I sat at my dining table with 3 sealed envelopes laid out in front of me, each labeled with a different recipient: bank compliance, division, federal audit, liaison, and personal legal counsel. Because once you decide to step out of someone else's collapse, the most important rule is this: you don't just walk away. You make sure the truth reaches the right hands at the right time. And timing in situations like this is everything. By that night, I had spent nearly 2 weeks quietly building a complete evidence chain. Every document photographed, every conversation logged, every financial record cross-referenced with public filings. Because unlike Lydia, I didn't need to hide anything. I just needed to place the information where it would become impossible to ignore. If you've ever prepared to expose a truth while pretending everything is normal, you know the strange, dual life it creates. You smile at dinner. You answer casual questions. You nod when someone talks about future plans, all while knowing those plans are about to disintegrate. Daniel was sitting in the living room that night, staring at his laptop screen with the hollow expression of someone watching numbers that refused to work. He hadn't slept properly in days. The audit deadline was closing in. The refinancing bank had sent a final warning notice that afternoon. 12 words that carried enormous weight. Secondary guarantor confirmation required prior to July 1st disbursement. Translation: without me legally bound, the Carter family would not receive the funds needed to prevent foreclosure. And Lydia knew it, which explained why her behavior had shifted dramatically over the past week. She wasn't aggressive anymore. She was careful, soft-spoken, even unusually polite. Because desperation changes tactics. Instead of pressure, she began trying persuasion. 2 nights earlier, she had invited me to dinner alone. A rare move. We met at a quiet restaurant downtown. She chose a private booth away from other patrons. And for the first time since I met her, she tried to appeal emotionally instead of strategically. "You don't understand how much is at stake," she said quietly, stirring her drink without looking at me. I didn't respond. She continued, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. "Our parents built this over 40 years. If the audit triggers enforcement, they'll lose everything." Lose everything. The phrase hung between us. But something inside me remained still, because I had already moved past the emotional layer. What mattered now wasn't her fear. It was her responsibility. I asked one simple question. Did you move trust funds into your personal accounts? Her hand froze. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then she exhaled slowly. It was temporary, she said. The same phrase again. Temporary. As if time erased accountability. I held her gaze. How much? She hesitated. Then finally said very quietly, $800,000. $800,000. Transferred out of trust accounts. And now, under audit scrutiny. In that instant, the scale of her desperation became fully real. Because that amount wasn't a bookkeeping error. It was a criminal investigation risk, which explained the sealed federal envelope, which explained the July 1st disclosure date, which explained why she had engineered everything to legally bind me before that moment arrived. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping. If you sign the integration forms, she said, the refinance clears. The audit gets delayed. We can fix everything quietly. Fix everything, meaning contain the fallout, shift the liability, protect herself. I asked another question. And if I don't sign, her eyes hardened. Then the bank calls the loans. The audit escalates. And everyone gets hurt. Everyone? Not just her, not just Daniel. Everyone. But what she really meant was something simpler. She would be exposed. That night at the restaurant, I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I just said calmly, I need time to think, which was exactly what she wanted to hear. Because people facing a deadline interpret delay as eventual compliance. And Lydia still believed she could control the outcome. What she didn't realize was that while she was trying to persuade me, I was finalizing something far more powerful than refusal. Documentation distribution. Back at my dining table on June 27th, I sealed the 3 envelopes one by one. Each contained identical evidence packages, loan summaries, trust amendment clauses, audit correspondence references, and most importantly, the wedding reception footage, still frames, showing Lydia staging her fall. Because coercion, tied to financial pressure, creates a very specific legal pattern. Undue influence. And undue influence invalidates liability agreements, which meant if Lydia tried to claim I was legally bound under pressure, I now had proof to dismantle that claim completely. As I finished sealing the last envelope, I heard Daniel's footsteps approaching from the living room. He stopped at the doorway, looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not frustration, something closer to defeat. Evie, he said quietly, Lydia told me you're still thinking about signing. I looked up at him, and for the first time in weeks, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Not fear of losing money, fear of losing control over a future he had always assumed was stable. I answered calmly, I am thinking about it. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. If you don't, everything collapses. There was a long pause. Then he asked the question that revealed the truth he had finally begun to understand. Did you know about the audit before the wedding? I held his gaze steadily. Yes, his shoulders sagged slightly, because that confirmed what he had feared. He hadn't been protecting me by hiding the truth. He had been losing my trust, slowly, irreversibly. He whispered one final question. Are you going to help us? The silence stretched between us, heavy, final, and in that silence, I realized something deeply important. This was no longer about revenge. It wasn't even about justice. It was about boundaries. Because sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't fighting someone. It's refusing to carry the consequences of their choices. I didn't answer him immediately. Because the truth was this. By the time he asked that question, my decision had already been sealed inside 3 envelopes that would be delivered the next morning. And once those envelopes reached their destinations, there would be no way for Lydia Carter to control what happened next, especially not at the Investors Gala on July 1st, the event where she still believed she would stand on stage, smiling confidently, while everything she had hidden quietly came into the light. At exactly 7:48 p.m. on July 1st, under the crystal chandeliers of the Grand Meridian Ballroom, with 214 investors, 2 bank vice presidents, 3 auditors, and Lydia Carter, standing on stage holding a champagne glass. A federal compliance officer stepped through the double doors and said 6 words that made the entire room fall silent. "Miss Carter, we need to speak now. Not later, not privately. Now." And in that instant, the carefully orchestrated confidence Lydia had been projecting all evening cracked visibly. But before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. Have you ever watched someone who built their power on secrecy suddenly realize there are too many witnesses for them to control the narrative? Because that moment, that exact moment, is when the truth becomes unstoppable. The Carter Investors Appreciation Gala had always been their most important annual event. It wasn't just a celebration. It was a reassurance ritual, a way to project stability to stakeholders, property partners, bank representatives, insurance underwriters, and potential future investors. Everything about the evening was designed to signal confidence. Lydia had spent weeks preparing it. Custom stage lighting, a polished presentation deck, even a scripted speech emphasizing growth opportunities and asset stability. The irony would have been almost amusing if it weren't so devastating, because I knew standing quietly near the back of the ballroom that by the time Lydia began that speech, 3 sealed evidence packages had already been delivered. One to the Bank Compliance Division at 9:12 a.m., one to the Federal Audit Liaison Office at 10:37 a.m., and one to my personal attorney at 11:05 a.m., which meant the timeline was no longer hers to control. It was already moving, and nothing she said on stage could stop it. Daniel stood near the front of the room that night, his posture stiff, his face drawn. He hadn't spoken much to me since June 27th, because he understood, not everything, but enough. He knew I wasn't going to sign the integration forms, and he knew the refinance deadline had passed without a secondary guarantor, which meant the loans were now officially at risk. What he didn't know yet was that something much bigger than loan enforcement was about to unfold. Lydia began her speech at 7:40 p.m. Her voice was smooth, confident, practiced. She spoke about navigating challenging market conditions, about strategic restructuring initiatives, about strong partnerships, ensuring continued stability. Every word was carefully chosen to reassure. But reassurance built on false information has a fragile shelf life. And at 7:48 p.m., that shelf life ended. The federal compliance officer, accompanied by a bank audit representative, entered the ballroom with quiet authority. No dramatic gestures, no raised voices, just calm inevitability, which is far more unsettling than anger. The room gradually fell silent as people noticed them moving toward the stage. Lydia saw them at the same moment Daniel did, and for the first time that evening, her voice faltered mid-sentence. Just slightly, but enough. The compliance officer stopped at the edge of the stage and spoke clearly. "Miss Lydia Carter, we need to discuss irregular trust account transfers and associated liability disclosures." A ripple of whispers spread instantly through the audience. Irregular, trust account, liability. Those words carry enormous weight in financial circles because they signal one thing above all else: risk. Lydia's face remained composed, but her fingers tightened around the champagne glass. "I believe there must be some misunderstanding," she said smoothly into the microphone. Denial, the first predictable stage. The compliance officer didn't argue. She simply handed Lydia a document folder and said calmly, "You were scheduled to review these disclosures today." Scheduled? That word echoed sharply because it confirmed what I had suspected. The sealed envelope in deposit box 317 had never been optional. It had been a formal notice with a timeline Lydia couldn't stop. Lydia opened the folder. Her eyes scanned the first page, and for a brief moment, the color drained from her face completely. Not dramatically, just enough that those close to the stage noticed. Daniel stepped forward, slightly, his voice unsteady. "What is it?" She didn't answer, because the second stage had begun. "Deflection. There are complex financial matters involved," she said quickly, turning toward the audience. "Nothing unusual for large asset portfolios." But the compliance officer spoke again, calm, precise. "Transfers totaling approximately $812,000 from trust accounts into personal control structures require formal explanation under federal audit review." A sharp murmur spread through the room. 800,000. Personal control structures. Those weren't ambiguous phrases. They were very specific and very damaging. Lydia's composure began to crack more visibly. Her voice sharpened. These were temporary reallocations authorized under Family Management Authority. Blame shifting. Stage 3. Because when denial fails, responsibility gets redirected. But the compliance officer didn't engage emotionally. She simply added one final statement. "The investigation also includes a review of attempts to attach external liability holders prior to disclosure." At that sentence, Lydia's head snapped toward the audience, and her eyes locked directly onto me. Because she understood instantly. The evidence packages hadn't just triggered the audit timeline. They had revealed her strategy. The attempt to legally bind me before the investigation became public, which meant something very specific. The narrative was no longer hers to control. She wasn't just facing questions about money. She was facing questions about intent. And intent changes everything. In that moment, under the bright stage lights, with hundreds of stakeholders watching, Lydia Carter reached the final predictable stage. Victimhood. Her voice rose strained. "This is a family matter being blown out of proportion," she said. "Our competitors have been pressuring us." But she stopped mid-sentence because she saw something that made her words die in her throat. I had stepped forward into the open space near the stage. Not dramatically, not angrily, just calmly. And in my hand was a thin folder containing one final piece of evidence she had never accounted for. The wedding reception footage still frames. Proof of coercion. Proof that she had attempted to manipulate me publicly to secure financial compliance. And as her eyes fixed on that folder, something inside her expression finally shattered completely. Because in that instant, she understood the one thing she had feared most. Not the audit, not the debt, not even the legal consequences. She had lost control of the narrative. In front of witnesses, she could never silence. And once control of the story is gone, collapse becomes inevitable. At 7:53 p.m., 5 minutes after the compliance officer handed Lydia Carter the audit disclosure folder, she dropped her champagne glass on the stage floor, and the sharp sound of shattering crystal echoed through the silent ballroom like a gunshot. No one moved, no one spoke, because in that moment, every person in that room understood something irreversible was happening. Lydia stared down at the broken glass for a second too long. Not because she cared about the mess, because she needed time. Time to think, time to calculate, time to figure out how to regain control of a narrative that had slipped completely beyond her reach. But there are moments in life when no amount of strategy can reverse what has already been exposed. And this was one of them. The compliance officer spoke again, her tone steady and professional. "Miss Carter, we need to step aside to discuss next procedural steps." Procedural. That word carries enormous weight in legal and financial environments because it signals something very specific. This is no longer a conversation. It's a process. Lydia lifted her chin slowly, and for a brief moment, I saw the final stage begin. Not denial, not deflection, not even victimhood, desperation. "This is not the time or place," she said tightly into the microphone. "We can schedule a private review." But the bank audit representative interrupted calmly. "The disclosure timeline has already been triggered under federal reporting requirements." Triggered, which meant there was no delaying it now. No negotiation, no private containment. The truth was officially in motion. And then something unexpected happened. Daniel spoke, not quietly, not hesitantly. He stepped forward onto the stage and said in a voice loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear, "Lydia, did you move $800,000 out of the trust accounts?" The room went completely still, because that question was no longer internal family business. It was public, documented, witnessed, and Lydia's reaction in that moment sealed everything. She didn't answer him. Instead, she turned toward him with raw anger. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she snapped. But Daniel didn't step back. For the first time in weeks, his posture straightened. Because doubt had turned into something stronger, realization. "You told me the refinancing would fix everything," he said, hoarsely. "You said the audit was routine." His voice cracked slightly. "And you told me Evie needed to sign because it was just a technical formality." Silence. Heavy. Final. Because now, the audience understood something else. This wasn't just financial mismanagement. It was deception. And that shifted the emotional current of the room dramatically. Investors exchanged uneasy glances. Bank representatives whispered to each other. Several stakeholders began pulling out their phones. Not to record, to contact legal teams. Because in financial circles, the moment trust breaks publicly, everyone moves to protect themselves. Lydia saw it happening, and something inside her composure finally broke. Her voice rose sharp and defensive. "I did what was necessary to protect this family," she said. "If I hadn't moved those funds, we would have defaulted months ago." There it was. Admission, not full, not explicit, but enough. And admissions made under public pressure carry enormous weight. Daniel took a step back as if struck. "You risked everything," he whispered. Lydia's eyes flashed. "I was trying to save everything," she shot back. Then she turned abruptly, and her gaze landed on me. For the first time that night, there was no calculation left in her expression. Only rage. "This is your doing," she said, pointing toward me. "You sent those documents. You triggered this." The accusation hung in the air. All eyes turned toward me, and for a brief moment, the room waited, expecting confrontation, expecting anger, expecting revenge. But revenge wasn't what I had come for. I stepped forward, calmly, my voice steady. "I protected myself," I said simply. "Nothing more." Because sometimes the most powerful statement is the simplest one. A quiet truth that cannot be twisted. Lydia laughed sharply, a brittle, hollow sound. "You think you're innocent," she said. "You married into this family, knowing there were financial risks." I met her gaze without flinching. "I married believing I was joining a family," I replied calmly, "not becoming a legal shield for someone else's choices." A murmur spread through the audience, because that distinction was clear and undeniable. Lydia opened her mouth to respond again, but the compliance officer spoke first. "Miss Carter," she said firmly, "we need to proceed now." 2 additional representatives had quietly entered the ballroom. Legal observers, witnesses, because at this point, documentation required formal presence. The process had moved beyond informal discussion. It was now official, and Lydia knew it. Her shoulders sagged slightly, not dramatically, just enough to signal the final stage. Collapse, not emotional breakdown, something quieter, heavier, the realization that control was gone, that consequences were no longer avoidable. She handed the microphone back to the event coordinator without another word. And as she stepped down from the stage, the room remained completely silent. Not out of sympathy, out of recognition, because everyone there understood. They had just witnessed the public unraveling of someone who had once appeared untouchable. Daniel stood frozen near the stage edge. His eyes followed Lydia as she was escorted toward a private conference room. But he didn't move to follow her, because something inside him had shifted too. The illusion of stability he had relied on his entire life had shattered, and he was only beginning to understand the full cost. As the ballroom slowly filled with low conversations and urgent phone calls, I turned quietly toward the exit. Not dramatically, not seeking attention, because my role in this was finished. The truth had reached the light, the evidence had spoken, and the consequences were now unfolding beyond my involvement. But just before I reached the doors, Daniel called my name softly. Evie, I stopped, not turning immediately, because I already knew what he was about to ask. And I knew the answer had been decided long before this night began. I turned slowly and saw something in his face I had never seen before. Not fear, not confusion, acceptance. He took a step toward me and asked the one question that would determine whether anything between us could still exist after everything that had happened. Is there any way to fix this? At 8:11 a.m. on October 3rd, exactly 94 days after the Carter Investors Gala, I sat alone on a wooden bench overlooking Lake Norman, holding a final court document stamped in blue ink that contained 2 words that felt quieter than I expected. Marriage dissolved. No drama, no raised voices, no courtroom confrontation, just a clean legal ending processed through Mecklenburg County Family Court in under 12 minutes. Because by the time the divorce hearing happened, there was nothing left to argue about. Not assets, not debts, not responsibility. Everything had already been decided long before we stepped into that courtroom. And the truth is, the end didn't feel like a victory. It felt like silence after a storm finally passes. If you've ever walked away from a situation that nearly pulled you under, you know this feeling. Not relief, not sadness, just stillness. The kind that comes when you finally understand that peace is worth more than being right. In the 3 months after July 1st, everything unfolded exactly as the timeline suggested it would. The federal audit investigation confirmed that Lydia Carter had transferred a total of $824,600 from trust-controlled accounts into a series of personal holding entities over an 18-month period. Not for luxury purchases, not for hidden lifestyles, but for something almost more dangerous, to cover escalating loan interest payments that the Carter properties could no longer sustain. It had started as a desperate attempt to keep everything afloat, then spiraled into concealment, then into deception, and finally into liability exposure. By mid-August, lien enforcement proceedings began on 4 of the Carter retail buildings. 2 more were placed under forced restructuring agreements. The family trust lost nearly 40% of its total asset value within 8 weeks. Financial collapse doesn't usually happen all at once. It happens in quiet, procedural steps. Paperwork, notices, deadlines, signatures, each one carrying irreversible consequences. Daniel cooperated fully with investigators because once the truth surfaced, he realized something painful but unavoidable. He had never truly been in control. He had trusted Lydia completely, and that trust had blinded him to the risks building beneath the surface. He reached out to me several times after the gala, not to argue, not to blame, just to talk. The first time was a month later when he called and said something that stayed with me. I thought loyalty meant standing with family no matter what he said quietly. Now I understand it also means being honest before everything breaks. There was a long silence between us after that, because sometimes understanding arrives too late to repair what was lost. I didn't hate him, but I no longer belonged in that world. And belonging matters more than forgiveness. Lydia's outcome was quieter than most people would expect. There were no dramatic criminal charges, because the investigation determined her transfers fell into a gray legal area tied to Trust Management Authority. But civil liability consequences were severe. She was permanently removed from trust control, ordered to repay substantial portions of the misallocated funds, and barred from serving in fiduciary financial roles for 7 years. In practical terms, that meant something very simple. The power she had built her identity around was gone, completely. And power once lost publicly is almost impossible to rebuild in financial communities where reputation is everything. I heard through mutual contacts that she moved to a smaller apartment in Raleigh, quietly, without announcement, without explanation. Because people who once controlled narratives often disappear when they can no longer shape them. As for me, life didn't transform dramatically. There was no sudden wealth, no dramatic revenge celebration, just steady, quiet rebuilding. I expanded my event financial consulting business, took on larger corporate clients, and eventually hired 2 junior analysts to support my growing workload. The most meaningful change wasn't professional, though. It was internal. For the first time in years, my life felt entirely mine. No hidden pressures, no financial entanglements, no emotional manipulation disguised as loyalty. Just clear boundaries, clear choices, and peace that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. Sometimes people ask me, especially clients, who hear fragments of the story, whether I regret anything, whether I wish I had walked away sooner, whether I wish I had fought harder. But the truth is simpler than that. Everything that happened taught me one lesson I carry into every part of my life now. You don't need to destroy someone who tried to use you. You only need to refuse to carry what was never yours. And that refusal alone changes everything. On that quiet October morning at the lake, a light breeze moved across the water, rippling the surface in slow, steady patterns. I folded the final court document carefully and placed it inside my bag, not as a reminder of pain, but as a symbol of something far more valuable. Closure. As I stood to leave, my phone vibrated with a new email notification. A prospective corporate client requesting a consultation for a $2.5 million event budget, a new project, a new chapter, and I smiled slightly. Not because the future was guaranteed to be easy, but because it was finally fully in my control. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, I want to ask you one last question. Have you ever had to choose between protecting yourself and protecting someone who was hurting you? Because that choice is never simple, but sometimes it's the most important boundary you will ever set. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. I read them more than you might think. And if you want to hear another story about quiet, intelligent revenge and emotional justice, stay with me. There's always another truth waiting to be told.